The dawn came slowly, spilling its pale light across the wide Wyoming plains, and Jedediah Cole rose as he always did, silent as a man half asleep, though he had not dreamed in years. He carried grief in his bones the way some men carried whiskey in their veins, heavier with every season, never loosening its grip. His ranch was a place of echoes, the clatter of buckets against dry boards, the rustle of wind pushing dust through empty corners, the groan of hinges when no hand touched them. He had not heard a voice in so long that silence had become a companion, rough but familiar. The morning chill bit at him as he crossed the yard. He walked toward the barn with his head bowed, boots crunching through frost-stiff dirt. The barn door stood ajar, swinging gently, though he was sure he had fastened it the night before. He slowed. His hand hovered at his side as if seeking the comfort of a weapon, but no pistol rested there. He had not needed one in years. Yet something in the air carried weight, a warning. He pushed the door open. The smell hit him first, dust, hay, old rope. And then, against the far beam, in a shaft of pale gold light, he saw a figure. For a heartbeat his mind told him it was a scarecrow, a trick of shadow. But the stillness was too human. The long frame too heavy with sorrow. A rope hung from the rafter, knotted at the neck of a girl whose boots brushed the packed earth floor but did not touch it. Jed's chest seized. He stumbled forward, instinct moving faster than thought. His knife was out before he knew it, slicing through the rough cord. The body sagged into his arms, far heavier than he expected, and for a moment he staggered beneath her weight. She was taller than any woman he had ever seen, shoulders broad, limbs long, the top of her head nearly brushing the low rafters even as she sagged. He laid her down on the straw, kneeling beside her. Her face, pale with a blue tinge at the lips, was still. But when he pressed his ear to her mouth, he heard it, a faint, ragged breath. "Easy now," he muttered, though his voice sounded foreign in the cavern of the barn. His rough palms cupped her jaw as he tilted her head, letting air move easier. Her pulse trembled beneath the skin of her throat, weak but stubborn. He fetched a tin cup of water, dribbling a line between her lips. She coughed, choked, then drew a deeper breath, and her eyes fluttered open. Gray eyes, clouded with confusion and shame. She turned her head away, as if unwilling to let him see her alive. "Don't," she whispered, voice cracked, barely sound at all. "Should have let me hang." Jed swallowed. He had no words for her yet, only action. He lifted her carefully, carried her into the warmth of his cabin, set her on the cot by the stove. He covered her with a quilt that had belonged to his late wife, a quilt he had not touched in years. As he tucked it around her long frame, he realized the quilt barely covered her knees. She seemed built from another measure of flesh and bone, not monstrous, but larger than life itself. Hours passed. She dozed, drifting between wakefulness and sleep. Each time she stirred, shame flashed across her features, as though every breath she drew deepened her burden. He fed her bread softened in milk, each bite small, coaxing her to swallow. When at last she found strength to speak, she said her name was Clara May. 19 years old, though the breadth of her shoulders and height of her body made her seem older. She spoke haltingly, eyes fixed on the floor. Folks had called her unnatural, giant, God's mistake. She had wandered from one settlement to another, never finding a place where laughter did not rise behind her back. The last town had chased her off with stones. So she had come here, to the edge of nowhere, to end the tale herself. Jed swallowed. He had no words for her yet, only action. He lifted her carefully, carried her into the warmth of his cabin, set her on the cot by the stove. He covered her with a quilt that had belonged to his late wife, a quilt he had not touched in years. As he tucked it around her long frame, he realized the quilt barely covered her knees. She seemed built from another measure of flesh and bone, not monstrous, but larger than life itself. Hours passed. She dozed, drifting between wakefulness and sleep. Each time she stirred, shame flashed across her features, as though every breath she drew deepened her burden. He fed her bread softened in milk, each bite small, coaxing her to swallow. When at last she found strength to speak, she said her name was Clara May. 19 years old, though the breadth of her shoulders and height of her body made her seem older. She spoke haltingly, eyes fixed on the floor. Folks had called her unnatural, giant, God's mistake. She had wandered from one settlement to another, never finding a place where laughter did not rise behind her back. The last town had chased her off with stones. So she had come here, to the edge of nowhere, to end the tale herself. Jed listened, silent. He had always been a man of few words, and grief had pared his tongue even further. But he knew the cruelty of whispers. His wife, Mary Ellen, had wasted away with fever, and in those years the town had muttered that Jed had done wrong by her, had not prayed hard enough, had not sought the right doctor. Gossip was a poison he knew well. In the nights that followed, Clara lingered in his barn rather than the cabin, perhaps ashamed to occupy a space that smelled of another woman's memory. He brought her meals there, left them on a stool, never forcing conversation. Yet each evening when he returned, the plate was clean. She moved with a quiet grace for her size, her footsteps soft despite the weight they carried. The town found out soon enough. A ranch hand riding past had glimpsed her tall frame at the well, and by sundown the saloon brimmed with talk. Jed rode in 2 days later for supplies, and every gaze followed him. "Cole's taken up with a giant," someone muttered as he passed. "Best watch your roof beams," another laughed. He kept his jaw tight, said nothing. But when he returned to the ranch, he found Clara sitting by the barn wall, her shoulders hunched, eyes red. She had heard them too. "They're right," she said before he could speak. "I'll bring you ruin. You can't keep me." Jed stood there, the sky burning orange behind him, and for a long moment he had no answer. He wanted to tell her that ruin had already found him years ago, that there was nothing left for gossip to take. But the words stuck in his throat. So he only shook his head, set down the sack of flour he had carried, and said quietly, "Eat." Her gaze flickered with something unreadable, and she obeyed. Days bled into nights. She began helping with chores, lifting hay bales with an ease that startled him, carrying water barrels as though they were buckets. The ranch, silent for so long, now echoed with the creak of wagons, the ring of tools struck against nails. Clara moved like someone trying to earn her keep, though no wage had been promised. One evening Jed watched her in the corral, crouched beside a lame colt. She stroked its trembling flank, murmuring words too soft for him to hear. The animal, usually skittish, leaned into her touch. For the first time Jed saw not only her size, but her gentleness, her strange kinship with creatures that trusted her despite the world's mockery. Yet shadows deepened. One night she whispered, as though confessing to the dark itself, "You should have left me hanging." He turned toward her, the lamplight catching her pale face. He could see the rope's burn still circling her neck like a brand. "Not on my land," he said softly. "Not in my sight." The silence that followed was heavier than any sermon, yet beneath it ran a current, something that might become trust, if tended. But trust was fragile. A week later, Jed heard horses in the distance, voices carried on the wind. He stepped onto the porch and saw lanterns bobbing down the trail, 3 men from town, their words sharp in the cold air. "Cole," one of them called. "We hear you're harboring that thing." Clara stood in the doorway of the barn, the lantern light catching her towering figure. She froze, eyes wide, shoulders drawn as though bracing for stones again. Jed felt the eyes of the men on him, waiting, measuring. The air was taut as wire. He knew the weight of his next word could tilt the world one way or the other. Clara whispered from the dark behind him, almost inaudible, "I'll go. I'll walk till the ground swallows me. Don't fight them for me." His throat tightened. He looked at the men, then back at the barn, then at the endless night stretching beyond his fence line. And there, with the stars cold above and the eyes of strangers burning into him, He stood on the edge of a choice that would bind or sever both their lives. The lanterns swayed. The horses stamped. The silence pressed closer, waiting for someone to break it. Jed did not move. Not yet. The night held its breath. The lanterns swayed in the night, their glow trembling against the black. Jedediah Cole stood on his porch, the boards creaking beneath his boots, and the three men from town fixed him with eyes that held more judgment than curiosity. Behind him, in the shadowed mouth of the barn, Clara May's figure loomed, uncertain, her breath ragged in the dark. The rope burn around her neck still flared red like a fresh scar, a reminder of what she had nearly chosen. The horses snorted, stamping the cold earth, and every sound felt magnified, every heartbeat straining against silence. Jed's jaw tightened. He had never been a man quick to speak, but now the weight of words pressed against him like stones. The men wanted an answer. Clara whispered again from behind him, a thin plea wrapped in despair, "Let me go. Please, don't fight them for me. I can't cost you more than I already have." But Jed did not step aside. He turned his weathered face toward the intruders, and though his voice came low, it carried with a steadiness that could not be shaken. "This land's mine. What stands upon it is mine to keep. She stays." The men shifted in their saddles, caught off guard by his calm. One, Elias Crow, the storekeeper whose tongue had poisoned the town for years, spat into the dirt. "She's a danger. Too big, too strange. You'll regret it, Cole. Mark me." Jed said nothing more. His rifle rested by the doorway, untouched, yet its presence was enough. The men lingered a moment longer, the lantern light flickering against their uneasy faces, then turned their horses and melted back into the prairie dark. When their hoofbeats faded, Jed looked back. Clara's shoulders had slumped as if the fight had drained from her bones. She whispered, "You should have let me go. They'll be back." Jed did not answer. He only reached for the lantern, lit it, and hung it by the barn door, as though declaring to the night itself that nothing in his care would be hidden. Days followed with the air charged, as though every dawn might bring riders cresting the ridge. Clara rose early, working harder than any hand Jed had ever known. She lifted hay bales with ease, patched fences, carried water. Her strength, mocked by others, became the very force that steadied the ranch. Jed watched quietly, noting how she never wasted motion, how she moved with a careful grace despite her size. Animals trusted her. Even the wildest colt leaned its head into her hand. Yet whispers thickened in town. Each time Jed rode in for supplies, men looked away, women clutched their children closer. He heard words muttered under breath, unnatural, witch's curse, freak. A few asked openly, "Why keep her, Cole? She'll ruin you." Jed spoke little, but his eyes, hard as iron, ended the talk before it grew teeth. Still, Clara felt the weight of it. Each evening her eyes sought the horizon, as though waiting for torches to appear. One night, as wind rattled loose shingles, she confessed, "Every place I go, I'm a burden. Maybe I'm meant to walk till no one sees me again." Jed leaned against the doorway, arms folded, the lantern glow softening his features. He thought of Mary Ellen, of how the fever had taken her, and how he had been powerless. He thought of the nights he had cursed himself for failing, the gossip that had cut him raw. He said, finally, "You're meant to work. To breathe. Same as any of us. That's enough." Her eyes shone with something unspoken, but she turned away, unwilling to let it bloom. The weeks drew toward winter. Jed and Clara fell into a rhythm. He began to expect her quiet presence at dawn, the steam of 2 cups of coffee rising side by side. He found himself listening for her voice, rare as it was, a low murmur that steadied more than it unsettled. A fragile bond, wordless yet undeniable, wove itself between them. But men like Elias Crow were not content with silence. It happened on a moonless night. Jed woke to the restless cry of the dogs, their barking sharp and frantic. He rose, rifle in hand, and stepped into the cold air. Shadows moved at the edge of the barn. Lanterns flared to life. 3 figures slipped inside, rough laughter muffled. Jed's heart struck like a hammer. He crossed the yard swift and silent, pushed the barn door wide, and froze. Inside, Elias and 2 others stood before Clara. They had cornered her against the wall, their words dripping cruelty. "Best leave, girl," one sneered. "Before we cut you down again, proper this time." Clara stood tall despite trembling hands, her broad shoulders squared, eyes blazing with a mix of terror and fury. She did not cry out, though she could have. She did not strike, though she easily might have crushed them. Shame and fear held her frozen. Jed stepped forward, rifle raised, voice low and steady. "Out." The men spun, startled. Elias sneered but shifted his weight uneasily. "She don't belong, Cole. You know it. Let us do what should have been done." Jed cocked the rifle. The sound cracked through the barn like a thunderclap. "This is my land. My say. She stays." The standoff hung suspended, the air thick with threat. For a moment it seemed violence would tear loose, but Jed's gaze, hard as stone, did not waver. At last, Elias spat again, muttered a curse, and motioned to the others. They slunk out, lanterns bobbing, swallowed by the night. Clara exhaled, knees buckling. Jed lowered the rifle, set it aside, and moved to her. She shook her head, whispering, "I'm nothing but trouble. You should have let them." He touched her shoulder, firm and steady. "They're wrong. You're here. That's enough." Her eyes brimmed, but no tears fell. She nodded once, a fragile acknowledgement, and the barn grew still again. In the days that followed, the men did not return. The gossip in town cooled to wary silence. Perhaps they had seen something in Jed's eyes, or perhaps Clara's presence had unsettled them more than they cared to admit. But the ranch endured, and with it, the strange, quiet bond between rancher and giant girl deepened. By the time winter's first snow dusted the ground, Clara was no longer a shadow hiding in the barn. She walked beside Jed, carried half the burden of the land, and shared the silence that was no longer lonely but companioned. At sunset they repaired a fence together, laughter faint but real between them, and for the first time Jed felt the ranch alive again. And though the world beyond their fence line still whispered, here in this place there was room for breath, for work, for the slow rising of something that did not yet have a name. The West was wide, its judgments sharp, its mercies rare. But sometimes mercy was not thunder, nor gunfire, it was a hand that cut the rope, a voice that said, "Stay," and a stubborn belief that no soul was too heavy to be carried. The snow thickened, the sky bruised with twilight, and the lantern by the barn glowed warm against the dark. Jed stood with Clara beside him, the land stretching endless before them, and though the road ahead was uncertain, the weight of solitude had lifted. They had chosen, together, to endure. And endurance, in the West, was its own kind of miracle.